Brilliant. Well, yeah, like I said, welcome everyone to the Emerging Economy Open Forum. And I'm going to pass over to Fatima and the team, and we'll get going and talk about our project. Again, any questions, feel free to pop in the chat. And yeah, we'll get going.
Thank you, Andy. So I'm going to start sharing my screen with you so we can share a presentation that we have created for this. And yeah, welcome to our second Open Economy Forum. We are going to be introducing a project that we developed with the University of Edinburgh and the University of Loughborough, specifically the Creative Horizon Research Cluster and Craig. So first of all, let's see who were participated in this project. So I'll just start very quickly and say that I'm a consultant at the Data City. This means that I work on projects and I see how people get the meaning. Now I will hand over to Caitlin, Jenny, and Harini so they can introduce themselves.
Super, thanks Fatima. So my name is Caitlin McDonald. I'm based at the University of Edinburgh. It's a very dreich day up here, as they say in Edinburgh. Obviously I'm not from around here, but I've been in the UK for about 15 years. And what we do at Creative Informatics is we help the creative industries try to become more facile with data. This is part of the UK's industrial strategy. There are 9 creative clusters around the UK. We are obviously based in Edinburgh. So our focus is on the creative industries in the Scottish region, particularly around Edinburgh and the southeast of Scotland.
I'm Jenny Jordan. I'm a research associate with the Centre for the Creative Research and Information and Innovation Centre. Sorry, it's very early still. Based at Loughborough University in London. Our interests are around research and development in the creative industries and how policy can be used to support the creative economy and development in that area. So we were interested in this work that Caitlin had initiated in order to look at how data is collected and used for decision making around innovation policy.
Hi, I'm Harini Nagesh. I'm a data analyst from the Data City. So I've worked very closely with Fatima in these interesting projects, and one of the projects I was very fortunate to be part on was working with Caitlin and Jenny. Yeah, so generally we work on projects. I mostly work pretty much with the platform, anything about lists. Yeah, so thank you. I'll pass it on to Fatima.
Brilliant. So now that you know a little bit about ourselves and who are our team and how, I'm going to hand over to Caitlin again, because we are going to start this webinar with an activity. So Caitlin, if you want to guide us through.
Yeah, absolutely. So what I'll start doing is I'll explain a little bit about the project and then we will do an activity. So please bring all your awakeness on this very gray morning out there. So what I first want to talk about is what the project we're talking about is all about. So at Creative Informatics, we run these projects called Creative Horizon projects. And what they are is a chance for researchers to do a really deep dive into some aspect of the creative industries, and they can range from all kinds of different things. But I think the thing to focus on here is that because Creative Informatics is an industry-academia partnership, a lot of the work that we do is really kind of industry-facing. And this was a chance to kind of dive a little bit more into what could we research that we wouldn't be able to do in an industry setting. And so I had a special interest in some research that my colleagues had previously done, which was showing that there was a real challenge around, in particular, data for freelancers in the creative industries, although that's not the only challenge. And so we wanted to take a little bit of a deeper dive into some of the methods that had already been explored and some of the new methods that the Data City and others are exploring around novel ways to try and capture information on the creative industries through web scraping and different kinds of digital analysis that perhaps were different from some of the existing ways that we take a look at creative industries. So I'm sure many of you will be familiar with the concept of SIC and SOC codes, the kind of methods that we use to describe particular industry activities. And in the creative industries, there are a number of challenges and also other dynamic sectors that are moving very quickly and evolving very fast. There are some challenges around how we use those types of industrial activity to describe innovation. And so we wanted to look at whether we could come up with some new things there that would be helpful. And these little drawings that you can see on the screen are actually illustrations of direct quotes that we had in the interviews that we did. And we found them so evocative that we actually got an illustrator to help us draw. And then we will describe a bit more about the project as we move through the presentation, but first we'll do the activity because that will give you a kind of hands-on experience of what it was like to actually do the research with us. So Jenny, do you want to kick us off with pockets of knowledge?
I do. This is my favorite bit. I love the pockets of knowledge. So as Caitlin has said, our research was kicked off by thinking about how we address gaps in the data about freelancers and sole traders. The DCMS says that at least a third of the workforce across the creative industries as a whole are freelance, compared with about 16% of the economy as a whole. So their absence was something that is potentially quite important to note. But I think even we were surprised by how often this gap in data was raised by the people that we interviewed. And one of our interviewees referred to freelancers as pockets of knowledge. And this is particularly important when we're thinking about innovation and R&D, because the literature on innovation talks about staff turnover and churn as being a catalyst for innovation as staff move between organizations. So if you have freelancers working on projects and constantly moving between organizations, then knowing who they are and what they're doing seems to be really important, that they're taking that knowledge with them to those new ideas. So that's why I particularly liked it, because it linked that movement to that knowledge and then asks questions about where we find data on that dynamic movement.
Yeah, and picking up on that point, the second quote that we heard from, and several people referred to this in different ways, but one person talked about it as being a massive jigsaw puzzle. The creative industries are a massive jigsaw puzzle. And when you think again about innovation and R&D, a challenge that we have with kind of traditional ways of describing industry verticals is that they're very rigid, and there's not a lot of, I'm not saying this never happens, but one of the challenges is when you're talking about industries that all interact with each other and have these kind of complex supply webs, you often get into a situation where you don't know whether to put a particular type of activity in one or the other. And this was a challenge with the creative industries as a whole, because they contribute to so many other industrial sectors. Somebody mentioned the wedding industry being massive, and the creative industry is contributing massively to that. Of course, design is part of the creative industries that contributes to absolutely everything that you can imagine, whether that's industrial design all the way through to something really innovative and imaginative. So the industry, the purpose of the jigsaw puzzle is, or the point of the jigsaw puzzle is to describe the challenge in talking about what it means to be innovative in a sector where you're kind of constantly trying to categorize things, and then they're resisting that categorization. And then the second thing I want to talk about is this concept of the wind tree. And we were talking about the innovation cycle. And in academia in particular, we tend to think of innovation as something that is kind of a three-stranded DNA model, where you have industry, you have academia, and you have policymakers, and all of those kind of contribute to the cycle of innovation, where you have policy that helps kind of set the direction. You have academia, which is really about bringing new knowledge to the table. And I have a problem with the idea that academia only puts knowledge out there and doesn't take it in, but sometimes academia sees itself in that way. And then the third part, of course, is industry, which is out there kind of building the things and making the things work. And so we were talking about this with one of our colleagues who works in another academia industry partnership. And what she really described was a role for an academic industry partnership, where the wind tree would be one in which it's kind of very clear what the policy landscape is like. So you can pursue branches, and some things do get culled because they need to, but also there's a very kind of clear path to success that allows both academia and industry to flourish in that way. And you probably can't see it; it might be a little bit small, but the fruit of the trees is little zeros and ones, because we believe that all of this is underpinned by data. And Jenny, if you want to take us finally through a safe refuge, then we can move into the activity.
Yes. So safe refuge is the idea that one of our interviewees said that data is a safe refuge in spaces where you have contested and hyperbolic narratives. It's a refuge against the boosterism that they tend to bump up against. And the reason for that boosterism is that there's a sense that there are gaps in the data that comes from neutral bodies, so the ONS or UNESCO or whoever. And so a lot of data that is being used by policymakers is coming from industry bodies themselves who are seen to have vested interests. So there's a desire to have data that is neutral, objective, that can be a safe refuge, to be mined carefully and provide reliable standing on which to build.
Yeah, really important concepts all around. Okay, so what we're going to do now is I'm going to take you through an activity. This is kind of a cut down version of something that we actually ran in groups. So with the research that we did, we talked to policymakers, we talked to people who are working in the creative industries, we spoke to people who work on data platforms, we spoke to people who are working in kind of creative trade bodies and coalitions, all kinds of different people who are who use either produce data for use of others or who themselves are using data about the creative industries to make decisions. So those are our kind of four major groups that we were speaking to. And often there are overlaps between those things as well. Different people thought about themselves in different ways. But one of the things that we really wanted to know was, where do people go now to get the data that they're using to make decisions? So what we're going to do is an activity which is called a chat waterfall. And the way that this works, so the clue is the name, open up your meeting chat. So you should be able to find a button to allow you to open the chat. And what we're going to do is I'm going to give you a task, and then I'm going to give you a little bit of thinking time so you can start typing in the box, but don't press send until I tell you. And the reason that we do it this way is so that everyone has a chance to contribute to the discussion without having to be influenced by what other people are thinking. And then we kind of have a look at what everyone has said, and we have a conversation around that. So in this case, what we did was we set up this idea that there was like an imaginary funding body. And this is from the perspective of the people who might be applying for funding. But we also ran a version that was for policymakers who were potentially being approached by a minister who was asking for some information, for example. But we'll do the one that was for the people working in the creative industries. So we said, okay, so imagine that you're filling out this application for innovation funding from some imaginary funding body. And they want to know a bunch of things about you, your business, and the way that you're working. So where would you go to find information about networking, people who are in your network? Where would you go to find information about benchmarking? Who else is doing things that are similar to you? Where would you go to find information about like broader sector landscape questions, that might be in the application? So I'm going to put that in the chat so you don't have to remember everything I just said, and have a little think. We'll give you about a minute and a half to think that through. You can start typing away, but please don't press send until I say press send, and then we'll all do this at once. And I'll give you some examples. So for networking, let's say that for this project, you needed to collaborate with a designer and a sculptor, maybe a metal worker as well, who knows? So, if a creative industries worker, where would those people, where would you look for information on that kind of thing? So that might be one example of a networking question. The second question I asked was about benchmarking. So I might want to know things like who else is working in Edinburgh, in my region, who's the biggest company that's working in the sector, in the kind of creative sector that I perceive myself to be in. How long have they been in business? How fast have they grown over the past 5 years? What types of ways do they describe themselves? If I look at their website, how do they talk about themselves as being innovation related? And then finally, thinking about the sector landscape more broadly, how many similar organizations have been working in Edinburgh for a particular period of time? How big are those companies? How many freelancers are there working in the sector overall? Where would I go to find all that information? So this is really the question, is where would you go to find information about these things? And I will, after we've had a chance to have a discussion amongst ourselves, we can tell you what we found from the groups that we did this research with and where they said they would go to find this stuff, or in many cases, what they thought was different or relevant that was not those questions. So I'll give you another 15 or so seconds. I'm hopefully seeing you all typing. I'm having a look to see if you look like you're typing. Not all of you have your cameras on, which is fine. So, all right, I'll give you another 5 seconds. And then when you're ready, you can press enter on whatever you've said so far. Hopefully you'll have some answers. That'd be great. Thanks, Ian. Thanks, Rupert. Lovely. So we're getting some Companies House answer, local authorities, Data City, of course, getting a shout out. FAME data, yep, ONS, Innovation Survey, UKRI. Internal CRM system, great example of different places. Google, yep. Local Creative Economic Network, LinkedIn, Chamber of Commerce. Okay, some great answers there. And as you can see, there's a real variety of different places. And what we found when we were talking to creatives about this was, first of all, no one ever asked for this. Actually, that's not true. It turns out people do ask for this. And the reason that we ended up asking about it as being a funding application is that's the main place that they do get asked about these things when they're making funding applications. But also sometimes they use this information for strategic planning for their organization, thinking about the years ahead or doing an annual report, things like that. So actually these pieces of information are very important, but often people would say, especially for networking, a lot of it was very, very personal, that they would use their own personal networks to figure out who they would collaborate with in particular. They wouldn't necessarily go and look at, Google unless they really had to. They would first try and use their networks. But then for other things, they became really curious about different ways that they could find. They didn't even know in some cases that you could find benchmarking information anywhere. So then as part of the work that we did, we also showed them the Data City platform, and they were, many of them, quite taken aback and wowed by those things. And they were like, we could definitely see how we would use this as we were thinking through our strategic planning or making applications or things like that. Jenny, is there anything you want to add on that point?
No, I think you've covered it. I think that covered it.
Yeah, and just to say also from the, I think from the policymaking point of view, what they told us was primarily that the way that they use information, like the things that we've described, because we asked them essentially the same things. Where would you go to find all of these different types of things? But from their perspective, of course, it's not about their own strategic planning for their organization, but a kind of broader sector narrative about how do we create the right policy that is going to create success for the people in the industry, but also, it isn't just about the people that are working in the industry, but about how to make that industrial sector more successful for everyone in the economy. So, for example, if you have skills missing in one area and actually another type of skill is going in decline, how do you encourage broader narrative pieces at play? But realistically, the actual data that you need for those things is largely the same. It's just as different in scale and different in terms of the kind of scope that you're looking at. Cool. Thank you so much for being such willing participants in that. And again, just to say, if you have questions, please do feel free to put them in the chat, and we will have time for a more open discussion at the end as we move through some of this. But we thought we'd go through some of the info first.
Caitlin, can I just ask a question? Because I'm reading through the chat and it's really interesting. Charlie, what's SAME?
Oh, it's one of the databases that.
Oh, right. Okay. Sorry. Yeah, I didn't know that. But, yeah.
One of the more, I suppose, traditional ones that kind of pull data from companies' house elsewhere, SIT codes, that kind of thing. So yeah, one of the
okay.
traditional ones.
Pulling on the same data as the data that we've done traditionally. Okay.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you.
Thanks, Charlie. Cool. Okay, I think we're ready to move on to our next piece, Fatima.
Brilliant. Thank you, Caitlin. And yeah, that was very good participation. So thank you all. Now, basically what I'm going to do now is explain you a little bit the project from our side, from the Data City side, and then I will hand over to Harini, who will give you all the details of everything that we did. But fundamentally, Caitlin and Jenny approached us because they were interested in alternative methods for industrial classification. So how can we create new data sets that represent the creative industries? And this is the way, or one of the main things or duties that we had in this project: create a new data set that would represent the creative industries in a way that was suitable or that would be more meaningful for creative practitioners. For that, we applied the DCMS definition of creative industries and run it through the machine learning algorithm of the platform and created the specific database. However, I just want to highlight before we move on that we had already done a little bit of work on the creative industries, but we only focused on digital creative industries. And with these, the only thing that I want to highlight is that there is still a lot of discussion on how we define the creative industries in the first place. And that is a key element that we want to participate in. We want to help defining these industries and just creating some form of cohesive standard, of cohesive way to see these activities. So now we'll hand over to Harini that will explain you everything about what we did for this project, data-wise.
So thank you, Fatima. When Caitlin and Jenny came to us, we decided we need to cover a lot of those traditional creative sectors, industries we might be missing from our digital creative industries Arctic. So what would be the best way to go about it? Because how do we define it was a conversation that we had, and we had to choose, because we have an existing database of TCMS of already defining it and using SIP codes, the kind of SIP codes attached to them. And we were able to develop it. We also built that on the platform. One of the interesting challenge was especially with the craft industry, and it was quite a challenge because craft was fragmented into different bits and pieces, and I think Scotland and the England had different definitions as well, and it was quite interesting. It's like, how do we incorporate this into a machine learning process, because it's also constrained by time as well. It was an interesting conversation to have. So we came up with a very we settled down for a mixed approach. So we decided to just crack on with some SIC codes that were pre-existing build lists, but also use our machine learning capabilities to have an overall coverage of the sector of the craft industries together. That was a really interesting challenge, and makes us think of how do we define it and how do we go about using this new method that we have to define a pre-existing framework of a sector. And that's how we mapped the craft industry. And going through that exercise brought us into a lot of conversations about, are these lists nice for specifically, I remember this conversation with the taxidermy list, because I was building these SIC lists for taxidermy specifically. And I remember I was on a call with Caitlin specifically, and she was like, I can't find any taxidermy companies in this list, in this SIC, because I was like, I know, I can feel that as well. So it is quite interesting to revisit and to see how SICs define themselves, and at the same time how machine learning defines. It was a quite interesting exercise. And it brings back to this concept of where do we draw the line, and what are the issues with specific to creative industries when it comes to defining these pockets of the creative sector. And I think there's a picture of the SIC that's been used for building the taxidermy list, and I'm pretty sure there are literally like taxidermies. It's quite old, and I'm pretty sure there are very few companies acting to it. But it makes you we approach these new sort of challenges as well. And so we built this beautiful data set of the creative sector. Fatima, can you change the slides, please? Thank you. Yeah. So when we built this, we built a custom sector for the creative industries, using the website scraping and machine learning processes. And the kind of information that you get, I'm pretty sure a lot of people are aware of it, considering everyone seems to know about Data City quite well. They know what sort of informations that you can get, the financial investment information, location data, job postings data. And these were quite useful for different people in different purposes. For example, when we run the workshop sessions, a lot of the creative practitioners themselves found the contact information for specifically like the social media websites to be quite interesting to understand what a company does. For example, like if the fashion designer is still doing, we have websites, we have company information, but do we know, are they still creating things and are they still innovating? So that they found that going to their social media websites and understanding the company's work and sort of work that they do, and if even understanding about plagiarism in their work was quite interesting, and how they found something that's very small, but they found that useful to do those things. So that was a quite interesting experience that we had. Can you move forward, Fatima? Thank you. Yeah, these are some bits and pieces of what you can find on the platform. And I'll just, after this slide, I'll just quickly show you the creative data that we built, sector data that we built for this project specifically. Just a quick preview of how does it look, what sort of categories we built. And obviously it's a work in progress. We're still understanding how we define it and how we can make that better as well. So yeah, so I would just wait for Fatima to unshare the screen and open the platform so we can quickly show you the data that we, just a quick preview of how does it look on the platform. Yep. So for this project, rather than building it as an Arctic, we made it into a custom industrial classification. So what does it do? It's basically available to selective group of people. So you can wish to publish it as an Arctic, which is available to everyone. But we decided to do this because, you know, it's still, we've considered this still as a work in progress. But yes, these are the categories that we built, and we used language and companies to understand these companies. We trained the machine learning with good examples and bring those companies together. And at the same time, we also grouped a lot of things together. For example, if you were to look into design specifically, you can see we have incorporated a lot of things together. Like, for example, design is very vague. What sort of design we have? Fashion, graphic, we've all put together, and defining, making it into smaller pockets due to time constraint as well was very hard. And at the same time, what are there can be different design things. What if there was something completely new that came up that we missed out to define as well? So one of the best thing that we did was we grouped it together. So they have, all of them have a very similar language, and we can use keywords to understand. Let's say I'm looking into graphic design specifically. I can just type in graphic design and hit update. You get companies that does graphic design. So those were the kind of things that we were able to incorporate as from taking the traditional framework and applying it to our novel method. And you can see here the companies, and if you were to just expand a company, you can see all the company information that can be useful for any sort of information. And one of the new things that we came up with is the company growth stage recently, to understand if it's a startup or if it's a unicorn. So these are the kind of information that you can get through company. And for a creative practitioner, these are the kind of information that typing in Google, and it's pretty much like a Google, but you have something with some custom built fancy filters as well. So it makes life easier sometimes. But obviously, there is always limitations when it comes to data. There's never perfect data. But yeah, if you were to just analyze this bit of information, we can just hit analyze, go to the analyze section of it, or click these 3 different dots and go to analyze, which would give a more sectoral view of the data rather than more individual companies, which can be quite useful for a policy making perspectives, and understanding the sector as a whole rather than looking into very few companies for grant applications specifically. So information on locations, some information on website text language, and then employees as well. And we also have the Arctics classification, which led on to the quite interesting conversation I think Fatima will continue picking up, is how are these sectors spread across, how are they connected together? Like for creative industries, I'm pretty sure as experts, they have overlaps with a lot of other sectors. Like for example, immersive technologies, tourism, they all have different overlaps between themselves, and understanding those, where do we understand those? Like, to have an idea of how do we get those information is where these Arctic classification give you. And this conversation led to a very interesting bit of work that Fatima did for the policy hack day. So she'll be sharing that later. But these are the kind of information that it looks, and you can see the SICs as well. We still have information on SIC, and which can be quite interesting to do comparison work as well to understand how SICs and the new methods work. And also obviously financials, which are very key when it comes to understanding the sector. So yeah, this was a very quick preview of how this data looks on the platform, and you can always come back and touch to us if you want to look into this data and maybe get some insights. But yeah, I'm going to pass it on to Fatima to add more about this interesting bit of work that she did.
Yeah, thank you, Harini. That was great. Just to finish with, by the end of the project, we had started thinking a little bit, how can we use our data to map supply chains or sectoral relatedness, meaning how different sectors or nodes of activities relate amongst each other. This is very important information from a policymaker or innovation cluster or project perspective, because it can show potential for knowledge and technology transfer. So what we did, and as Harini has briefly mentioned already, is see how different companies that have been captured in our creative industries data were also captured in other articles. Just as a little bit of context, our classifications or real-time industrial classifications, how we build our data sets, is all based on language as a criteria. So if a company has relevant language patterns for the creative industry sector, but also has relevant language patterns for another sector, the algorithm, the platform will classify them at the same company in both sectors at the same time. This is an indication for us that a company works in two fields at the same time, simultaneously, and that therefore can serve as a bridge between sectors or nodes of activity. So let's explain a little bit what you can see on the screen now. You can see a network map that represents different articles or sectors, that is the creative industries in pink and another 6 in blue. And the size of the nodes, the size of the circles represent how many companies that article shares with the rest, the total number of companies, and then the links represent the total number of companies that have been classified in two articles at the same time. So thanks to this, we can see very easily how the creative industries has a tighter relationship in terms of like shared companies with business support services than with media and publishing. It is interesting to see as well that the creative industries has a tight or tighter connection, it has a less tight connection with research and consulting in physical sciences as it has with media and publishing. However, these two are also related. So what we can see all together is that there is a network for the provision of creative services and products, and that it is not only the creative industries involved in that provision, but many other sectors at the same time. And this relationship also works in vice versa, meaning that other sectors need from the activity of creative practitioners to provide their services and products. And this is why we are starting to think about supply chains and the economy in terms of networks, and not separating too much one field of activity from the other, because we are seeing that interconnectedness is just becoming the norm and in emerging economic sectors. So now that I have quickly gone through this, I will stop sharing my screen again and go back to our PowerPoint. And I will hand it over to Jenny, who will explain a little bit more about the emerging themes that we got from this research.
Thanks, that's really interesting. I do love that dynamic of the network. So what we found in the research really was that there's extensive research about the creative industry, some of which covers data, and quite a bit which is looking at or is being done by novel uses of data currently. So what were we uniquely looking at? So we were particularly looking at data for innovation and R&D to support policy in that area. And we found 3 emergent themes about what people were interested in, why and how they use data for decisions, and how they do that specifically. So the first thing was about innovation ecosystems. I liked Caitlin's idea of the supply web rather than supply chain. I think that that's a much better explanation of what's happening within the creative industries. But the idea of the ecosystem is also relevant. Innovation doesn't exist in a vacuum. It requires inputs and resources from outside. Sometimes those are outside a particular firm, but they can also be from outside the sector. And the literature talks a lot about spillovers as ideas move from one setting to another, and those ideas in the new setting can be turned into innovative new products and services. And one of the key factors is knowledge transfer as people move jobs, as I mentioned. So in the creative industries, that knowledge transfer is structural in the form of freelancers.
Can I jump in for a second?
Yeah.
Just to say, Rupert's asked a really interesting question in the chat, which really relates to this, which is that a lot of production companies in motion picture and television are essentially transient organizations, and that would be a really good example of where you get these kind of coalescence of very high-powered skills, and then they all go off and do new things, and they coalesce into new configurations. So yeah. I think it's also a really good example. Thanks, Rupert.
I think it is, and that creates 2 particular data issues, one of which is the fact that we know that Companies House doesn't collect data on freelancers, so that's an issue. The second thing is that a lot of the data that is collected is historic. So it's not actually collecting what's happening now. So the data that we have that isn't necessarily from Companies House, it is from things like evaluations or responses to funding, reports on back to funders, that kind of stuff. So it's kind of historic rather than forward looking. And when we're looking at R&D, we need to know what's happening now in order to make policies that work for the future. But we also know that the creative industries are not exclusive. So Creative Informatics has some research that shows that lots of people working in the industries are also working in other sectors like hospitality, events, retail, wherever. So they're taking those, sorry?
Academia as well.
Academia, yeah, they're moving in and out of academia as well. So we know that those ideas are spreading out from the creative industries, and that innovation is affecting elsewhere. So we needed ways to do that. And we need data in order to supply that safe ground for decision making. So one of our interviews, it called Data the Bridge, that enables change to happen because it provides evidence that there's a real problem to solve or an opportunity to grasp, and the scale of that opportunity or problem. But as I said, that's kind of these dark matter. The stuff we don't know is really important. So we don't know about, we also don't know, one of our interviewees called analog data. So the embodied knowledge about materials or about how to use tools was something that's missing from the information that we have. So when we're talking about craftspeople and makers, that's actually key to what they do, that they might take a piece of equipment and use it in a very different way from the purposes that it was created for, and really push what it can do and what it can't do. And you know, if that gets back to the person who made that piece of kit, that might become another product or service that they can then market. So these are really interesting places for innovation that can feed back into more standard parts of the economy, but we have to capture that knowledge somehow. And what we also found, which was really quite interesting, and it came up in the comments that people were making, that we found that policymakers working in regional or local government were all collecting their own data on their own creative economies and making their own data sets and platforms in order to make sense of that information was there, because they couldn't find it in the other data. So there's lots of local individuals with this knowledge, but it's not being collated. And we also found that there were other platforms that were collating data. So we found people were collating data on ticket sales, people were aggregating data on events, people were aggregating data on a range of different elements that were useful for this. And one of the most exciting things for me that came out of our research was that we had a session where we brought various different platforms together to talk about the data that they're collecting, to think about how they might work together. And we're hearing about potential collaborations that are starting as around open data sets that might allow for more standardization between those data sets to allow for innovation to happen in how we collect data, how we share data, and the products and services that might come out of that as a result.
Yeah, and just to say, that little bottom picture there is the precarious pile of knowledge, as one of participants described it, that they had collected and then were like hoarding in their Google Drive or wherever it was, which I'm sure you're all familiar with the precarious pile of knowledge. Great. So I can see that we're kind of coming up towards the end of the hour here, and I want to make sure people get a chance to ask questions as well. So if at this point you have something that you'd like to contribute to the discussion, maybe just put your hand up using the hand function, and Fatima or Harini can...
Hi, Caitlin.
Yeah.
Hiya, it's Emma here from the Data City. I've been answering a few questions as we've been going, but there's a question from Rupert, if you can see in the chat.
I can, and I actually can't answer that one because that's more of a technical question. So perhaps Fatima or Harini could address that.
Can you see that, guys? So Rupert's question, I'll read it out. So in the motion picture television part of the creative industries, some of the biggest players are production companies that exist only for the duration of the filmmaking. These are big but transient players. Does that impact the mapping?
Well, the important thing to understand about our data is that we based it all on Companies House. So everything that we have on the platform has to be an active company as per Companies House. So if these companies actually get registered in Companies House, even if it is for a small duration of time, since our classifications are based on real-time data, we would be able to map them for the time that they are actually active. The only situation or the only context where we wouldn't actually map it or that we wouldn't actually capture it is if they never declare themselves as a company, as a legal entity, as a company in Companies House.
Super.
So yeah, it definitely, in short, it definitely affects mapping, because we really need to bring those considerations in, that maybe from one year to the other, there's a series of very big companies, as you have mentioned, that may disappear, not because they are not successful, but just because their activity, their production activity has finalized.
Yeah, and that's a great example of one of the unique challenges for the creative industries. And I'd say another one, so one of the things we talked about as we were doing the research, for example, is that a lot of the creative businesses, so Innovate UK funding is in the platform, but for example, Arts and Humanities Research Council, which actually funds quite a bit of research into the creative or R&D activity in the creative industries, isn't currently in the platform. So that's the kind of thing where there probably is activity happening that the platform can't currently see. And so that would be an example where there's a unique creative industries sector piece of information that could be captured in a different way.
Yeah, and I would add to that things like the Arts Councils that money isn't there either. And you know, a lot of that is predicated on people doing innovative work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, really great point. I'll briefly talk about the Policy Hack Day. If you have questions, raise your hand, stick it in the chat. We're more than happy to make this a more open discussion. And just to mention as well, so Creative Informatics is going to be publishing a white paper with all of the findings that we had from this research project. It will be out very soon. I just had the graphic designer sent me some samples today. They look very exciting. So I'll just put in the chat the Creative Informatics website. So if you go there, you can sign up for our mailing list and we can tell you when that white paper is available, probably around Christmas, maybe a little bit after. So we'll be, all of the kind of findings we've shared with you today will be in that, along with some key core recommendations that we've made about what policymakers should do, what individual creatives should do, creative companies should do, and data platforms. So stay tuned for that. And then just briefly to talk about the hack day that we had. So one of the things that we did in this research, we had kind of key ways of collecting data. We did individual one-on-one interviews. We ran some workshops to try, that was the activity that we went through earlier, was in the workshops that we did to kind of find out how people were using the platform or might use the platform or what else they were using. And then we also ran what we call the Policy Hack Day. So we got all of the different kinds of players that we talked about in the room together to talk through some of the early findings that we had and to help get suggestions from them about what improvements they would want to see. And so we had various different kinds of learnings from that that we can talk about on our side, but I'm also really interested in the Data City sharing what they learned from the Policy Hack Day as well. So
thank you, Kathleen. I'm just going to go through these very quickly, and I'm sure that Caitlin, Jenny, and Harini will want to highlight a couple of themes or concepts that are more relevant to them. First of all, for us, for the Data City, this was a unique experience because we hadn't work with academia that much. This was our first project with a big academic institution. Then this has given us an experience that now we're using in other projects. So this, overall, the preposition of the project and academic research, it was different to us, and we can see how our data can be applied for these purposes as well. One of the main themes that we highlighted is this, the importance of data transparency. At the end of the day, if we don't share data openly, if we don't cohesive and standardized ways of understanding industries, communication between parties becomes very, very difficult. And we see that in terms of policymaker making and also for innovation projects, communication and being able to speak the same language, it is key. Then this led us to a conclusion or a conversation around common data standards. In order to be able to communicate effectively, we have to have a standard, a common data standard that we can all reference to in order to make conclusions and to have a clear path before us. And then the last thing that I want to highlight is that we saw that for practitioners, for people in research, for ourselves as well in the industry, it is very important to break this linearity in the data cycle. As innovators, it is very important that we find new methods, create new technologies, and develop new ways of thinking that just bridge this gap and break or challenge some of the limitations that we have found and that the creative practitioners find. Don't know what, Caitlin, Jenny, Harini, do you want to add anything here?
do you want to jump in, Jenny?
I was just going to say that we have some blog posts on the research as well, which pull on some of these separate elements, I think. So if you wanted to know a bit more about what we've done from those things, I was just looking up the link to yours, Caitlin, but perhaps if you want to put that in, you can put that in. And there's one on the Data City as well. This is one that I've just put in the chat about what one of our interviewees called the dark matter. so the missing elements and how some of the ideas that we came up with about how that might be moved forward as a result of the hack day. So yeah, that's on the CRAC site at Loughborough.
Yeah, I'll put our the Creative Informatics blog post in as well. Just give me a second. And I think one of the things that was really important to me. So Fatima mentioned that the importance of collaboration, and I think also the importance of interdisciplinarity. So I think we found a lot more by getting lots of people who were producing data and consuming data in different ways, and analyzing, processing data, by getting everybody in the same room. There's something, one of the things that we found overall through the Creative Clusters program, and I would say both for Creative Informatics and other clusters in the program, what they've said is that the university acting as a trusted broker between different industry bodies that might ordinarily be wary of each other, and then finding the university to be kind of trustworthy space that they can talk to each other in, was really useful. And I think that is a really great example of that happening in this case, where a lot of platforms who normally would kind of be in competition found actually there are some things we can collaborate on effectively as well, and that will be better for everybody. So that's really useful. I think the other thing about that was useful, both for the platforms, but also for the people working in the creative industries and some of the industry bodies that we spoke to, they really started to think about how do we think about data differently? Like, even if we're using the actual same facts, how is it that we use data in different ways? And that was really useful, in particular around some of the interviews that Jenny and I did around innovation. We found that people were really talking about it very differently. And that's really important if you're thinking about the way that a policymaker thinks about innovation and is therefore making decisions and driving policy, as opposed to a creative company who's trying to think about what innovation means for them. And maybe, for example, self-excluding from different types of innovation activity or opportunities because they think that those things aren't available to them because they don't like the word innovation, for example. Like that's an interesting challenge that the policymakers might be like, well, no, it's not our problem. We know what innovation is. And it's like, well, no, actually it is your problem, because you're then missing out on something that can make the economy better for everybody. So I think that's really important as well.
Thank you all. Sorry, Caitlin, I suddenly got this slide a tiny bit earlier before you finished but yeah, we have got to the end of this presentation. We have a few minutes left. It would be great if you want to share some questions with us. Feel free to mute yourself or to use the chat. That is absolutely fine. And if you have any doubts about the project, or if there's anything more that you want to know, please let us know, or feel free to reach us, contact us by email, because we can also arrange a separate chat. So let me just have a look at the brilliant. Thanks, Rupert, for that comment. It is, yeah, we agree. It is a very important thing that we really.
And actually, I might throw a question to the audience, which is, what are you taking away from this hour that we've spent together? You've all been so attentive, and we really appreciate it. So I'd love to know what's really standing out for you from what we've talked about. Silence.
Well, there we go. So Mark. Yeah, we are very happy to hear that, Mark, because if this is making you think that there's new ways in which we can help policy development, that is brilliant.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Awesome. Thank you so much for everyone for joining, and a really big thank you to Kathleen, Jenny, Fatima and Harini for the session today. Again, feel free to check out the websites that were shared for Kraken Creative Informatics, and then also check out the Data City. Again, we'll be running these sessions again in the new year. So any suggestions or feedback for themes, things that you'd like to see more in the new year from January onwards, please give us a shout. But yeah, thanks again for everyone for joining. And again, we'll be sharing the recorded session in the coming days. But thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot, guys.